clock has struck 3 a.m. The witching hour has begun. Are you ready to be initiated into the black magic coven? Join your sisters, Marisa,
Liz,
Kaleigh,
Andrea,
as we meet to discuss the macabre, creepy, and sinister. We call upon the four corners to study the art of the good death and alternative burials. Okay, so this might be a little bit of a somber episode, but I personally think it's really interesting and a good time for it, thinking on the positive side. But and I know you guys are excited about it too. Did anything initially stick out to y'all when this topic came up?
Well, I suggested this topic to Tim after reading Caitlin Doughty's, I think that's how you say her name, Caitlin Doughty, is that right?
I think so.
After reading her book, and I just found it so interesting, and it just reading about our, where we are today and like what other options are out there and how we're so stuck in, our tradition here in the United States. It's just very interesting. And so I thought it was something that I didn't know a lot about before reading the book. And so I thought it would be a good topic for the podcast because I think, we don't talk enough about how, this isn't something people like to talk about necessarily. It's not like a fun topic, but I think it's an important thing and it's a part of everybody's life. So yeah, I just thought it would be a good thing to talk about.
Yeah, I didn't know much about the topic other than just, I think each family has traditions where people have funerals where someone's buried in the ground, or some families, more of their, family members are cremated. But I was really disappointed when I learned how horrible the whole embalming, and I know you guys are going to get into a lot more about how bad it is for the earth and how unhealthy it can be. That it's something that's so widely accepted that I had no idea the need for non-traditional burial methods that ones that already existed that I'd never heard of before. So it was very interesting.
Yeah, I also didn't know a lot about the topic. I think what's most interesting to me is I have heard of some alternative methods of burial, and that always struck me as there's so many other things you can do to help the science community or to benefit the earth in some way, as opposed to doing a traditional method of embalming and burial.
Yeah, I agree. I stumbled upon Caitlin's book, like you mentioned, Liz, her first one called Smoke Gets in Your Eyes, and it's basically like an autobiography of her time as a mortician and how she worked and when she worked out in a crematorium in LA. And it was one of those situations where I was, you go browsing through a bookstore, you don't really know what you want. I think I was in the self-help section, and there was a death and dying part of it, and I saw that book, and it references, I think, a Smokey Robinson song, and I picked it up, and I thought it was super interesting, and I read it, and I couldn't put it down, and then that kind of opened a whole new world to the funeral industry, the death industry, and just how corrupt is sort of a negative word, but I think there's just so much knowledge and options for people out there that they just don't know and don't have access to, both because of how closed off Americans are to death. I think death and sex are two very taboo topics that are, more open and explored and talked about in other parts of the world, except America is very much hands off, and both subjects are very taboo. So she kind of pulls the veil behind the death industry, and in a comical way and lighthearted way, because, y'all were saying it can be a really daunting topic. It's, I've been called a Debbie Downer too many damn times because of how much I talk about this shit and how much I talk about, alternative practices and stuff. But that was a couple years ago, and I just wish I had that information when I was a teenager. And I just hope that more and more, people are exposed to this. So I think it's a great episode. I'm super excited to talk about it. I'm going to start with, I guess, with like a personal story that, sort of set me off into being really involved with Caitlin and her organization called the Order of the Good Death. And she essentially not only is revolutionizing the funeral industry, but she's, opening up options to alternative burial practices, green burials, exploring like other cremation processes, and both ways to benefit the environment. But, in having these sort of options available, these conversations are becoming more prevalent as well. So she's sort of taking away that taboo nature of talking about death. And even most recently, she has a book that came out called, I forget what it was. Do Cats Eat My Eyeballs? I think When I Die. It's like a children's book, and all of them.
Yeah, it's
it's like all of the questions that kids have about death that they're usually sheltered from. And I remember an interview with her that I watched online, and she said one of the most interesting things was on her book tour. She only had, not for that book specifically, I think it was her second book, but she only had kids. The only country that she went to that did not have kids in attendance was the United States. So it just kind of, goes to show that death is something that is very sheltered in our country. Kids are taken, it's kind of like, it's just everything is so sugar coated, and it doesn't necessarily have to be that way. You can have these kinds of conversations in a rational, straightforward, and even scientific approach, and even religious approach, if that's your thing, without completely masking the reality of it. And, kind of approaching that everyone has a happy ending, there are no bad things that happen in the world type lie that some parents choose to do. So the concept of the order.
Well, I mean, think about pets. I mean,
right.
Like we, I feel like such a common thing is like parents to be like, oh, well, the dog just went to the farm and like he's not going to be back or whatever. And like, it's like, why not just tell your kid that the dog died? Like, that is like their first introduction to the concept, and that's good. It's healthy to like know that like, okay, like, that's sad. I'm upset and I'm going to grieve this dog that I loved, but it's also part of the world, and I need to like understand it and have a healthy relationship with the concept instead of just, oh, we're gonna pretend it didn't happen. It's like, it's just so weird to me that we are so obsessed with like pretending it's not there and not talking about it at all.
Yeah. That's interesting. It's like the second time in a couple weeks that that specifically has come up with children and death, because I had seen the Scary Stories book documentary, not the movie that was made, and they were talking about in that, because a lot of the parents were freaking out and banned the book because of the depictions of death and gruesome nature. And one of the psychiatrists that was in it was discussing that like kids they want to know what's going on, and they're not dumb, and when they ask like what happens after I die, they don't want to hear, oh, you go to heaven. They want to know like what happens to me when I die. And so I think that's awesome that Caitlin's approached that, because I think it is very important to normalize that for kids, and then it's not as traumatizing. I mean, it's never going to be easy to lose someone, but when like it's going to happen to all of us and everyone we love, and growing up, if you're not sheltered from that, I think it's super beneficial.
Yeah, totally. And Scary Stories is actually really death positive, and she sort of cultivated this concept of like the death positive movement. And what that means is, it's not that death is not sad anymore and not scary anymore. It's embracing your mortality, and being able to have those kinds of transparent conversations, be able to plan for what's called a good death, which means that your affairs are in order. You've said goodbye, or you've said, you've let everyone know that you love them, that you do care about them. You're not leaving any sort of like unfinished business, and you've been able to embrace your mortality and live your life to the fullest, to where death is not as scary as it could be, and then it's not as difficult, leaving behind those who may have been in your family or friends with their affairs out of order. And, you know, it's kind of like being proactive instead of reactive when talking about death and funeral planning. And I think that was so revolutionary because I don't get too personal when I in my articles or writing, but you know, I am very passionate about this topic in particular because I wish that I had this sort of information when I was younger, because I had lost my dad when I was 15 years old, and I knew that there was something wrong with the way that we handled bodies and our whole entire practice at a young age, but I felt like there was nothing that I could do about it. And I knew that it was just uncomfortable. Like, why is this the only way? Or why do we have to do it this way and not that way? I mean, it was because when he passed away, he actually passed away in my childhood home. So we weren't in a hospital. And it's interesting because, you know, dying in a sanitary environment or a hospital is like a newer concept. In the late 19th century, dying at a hospital was actually reserved for, indigents. So people who are more poor, and, you know, home burials were actually the norm. Like, people wanted to, if given the choice, they wanted to die at home with their family and friends. And so at the beginning of the 20th century, more than 85% of Americans still died at home. That kind of changed over time, but it's kind of gone back to the sense now where, like, if you were given the chance, you can die at home. You have, like, what's it called? The
like hospice care.
Yeah,
can come into the
hospice.
home. Mm-hmm.
So we had hospice come in, and in his, you know, final days, they were there helping and everything. And so I was thankful for him to pass away in the home. We don't still own that house, but it was kind of nice for him to be there and, you know, not be in a hospital, because we had spent a lot of time in the hospital. He passed away from non-smoker's lung cancer, by the way. And so, yeah, having him pass away at the home, I went into shock immediately afterwards. I saw him die. I was right there by his side, holding his hand. Went into shock, sat down for about 45 minutes, don't remember anything. And then the next thing I remember is his body being transferred out of our home in a black body bag by two guys I had never seen before. And then a lot of my mom's friends were there. A couple of my friends were there. And I was in like 9th grade. So, I mean, it was just so awkward. And I didn't get the chance to really spend time with him or his body after he passed away. I mean, the time frame that when he died to when he was carried out of our house was an hour.
Oh my gosh.
Wow.
Yeah, there was no processing in my mind, and there was no, like, you say goodbye, but it's like, it's just such a weird feeling. And I just couldn't really process it, especially as a kid. And then I didn't see his body again until the wake. And then you're there and there's all these people and you have to put on this face to be social. You don't know how to act, especially as a kid. The wake is so awkward. And then there's the funeral. And so I never really had a chance alone or with just my family to be with my dad and say that intimate goodbye. And there was always this like social pressure and people being like, do this next, you have to do that next, you have to do this. And everything felt so rushed, everything felt so laid out, and like, you have to do this, you can't do that, these are your options, these are your only options. And reading her book and learning about different options was just so revolutionary. And I wish I had those kinds of, that kind of information when I was younger, especially with him, because a lot of that process that people readily see is not the only option that you have. And I think a lot of Americans don't fully understand that. The whole idea of planning in general is taboo, but it's so, so, so helpful. And, thinking about your mortality and thinking about your death and planning about it. I mean, if you take the time to look into options, what you need, think about a will, think about your assets. I mean, even having like your passwords laid out for your family or your friends afterwards, you know, those sources weren't really there in 2002. You know, the internet was not nearly what it is now. So, yeah, it was just kind of mind-blowing to me. And I just think it's so beautiful what they're doing, Caitlin specifically, with opening up, you know, all these different, bringing together all these death professionals and artists and scientists as well, with there's so many different options. But yeah, I mean, and that was super common. I mean, traditionally in the United States, you know, you pass away, you are rushed out, the body's rushed out. If you want to be cremated, you have to do so within like 48 hours. And then if you are buried, you know, you go through specific options with caskets. I mean, the cost of an average funeral in the United States is anywhere from between $8,000 and $10,000. And that's at the bare minimum. If you've ever looked into, like, have y'all ever gone into a funeral home and sat down with the funeral director and gone through your options?
No.
Yeah. Well, in high school, we had a death and dying course my senior year. Now, granted, this was 20 years ago, but they took us to a funeral home, and the entire thing at the moment felt really awful to me, because it was like the whole thing was a sales pitch to high school students, for our parents, basically.
Right.
But yeah, they didn't go through many options in the class, but the end of it, we went to the funeral home and they went over everything, and the cost then even, and most of the plans, like you purchase and you pay monthly, they don't even include the opening and closing of the ground, because it depends on what time of year it is, and that can be an extra like $2,500 if the ground's frozen.
Yep.
That's insane.
Yeah, and then so a few years ago, I lost my dad, and Marisa nailed it on just the whole, like, because I'm Catholic, so we do a wake the night before, and then you go in the morning, and it's like an all-day thing. We were very lucky, though. The hospice that my dad was in, he went from the hospital to a place instead of going home. They actually gave us like almost a day before the funeral home came to pick him up. So people did have some time, because we've got a huge family. He's got like a bunch of brothers and sisters, and so everybody was able to come and kind of spend time with him if they wanted to say anything. And so that was, I think, something that maybe has progressed in people understanding that the family does need that before a decision's made on what's going to happen with the body.
Oh yeah, I mean, well, I think it's awesome that you had a course like that in high school. That's really impressive. Yeah. And the sales pitch aspect is also totally dead on, and no pun intended. I do that all the time. But yeah, I mean, going and sitting down with them, it's just so interesting, especially if you don't know what you're looking for, what you want, and what you're doing. If you are part of this concept of like the good death is being prepared and thinking about this beforehand, so you're not making these kinds of decisions for yourself or your family members in a time of mourning or stress. So, you know, it's very easy to, from a sales perspective, capitalize on grief and capitalize on someone's mourning by, you know, don't you want this expensive oak, you know, furnished mahogany, nice casket that they'll spend forever in and it won't, you know, tarnish or what have you? And don't you want this nice plot that is, you know, in this specific location? And, you know, like the best of the best. When you're mourning, right, of course you want your loved one to be in the best of the best. And those dollars just add up and add up and add up. And you're also just frantically like trying to make decisions, still mourning, still in shock. And so the after effect of funeral planning after losing someone is just, I think the funeral industry capitalizes on it. And you also don't know what your options are all the time. And if you're not educated on it, then you just take what they give you at face value. So some of the things that people may not know is that when you get cremated, you can have items in the crematorium with you. You can, you know, pretty much be buried with anything. Some things don't burn, obviously, but I mean, if you wanted to be buried with like a vinyl or a book or a kid with a teddy bear or something, you can definitely do that. And they don't really talk, funeral industries don't really talk about that. They can also have a particular person press the button if you like, as opposed to a complete stranger. You could watch if you want to. And these are all questions that I asked a funeral director, and he was like, yeah, you could do that. You could do that. You could do that. And I said, well, why don't you put that in your plans? Like, why don't you put that in your one sheet when you're giving people options? And he was kind of taken aback by it, and I was like, this is part of like the intimacy of being able to have a say in what happens to your body and what happens to, the body of your loved ones, and having some sort of control too over something that many of us fear because there is no control. We don't know when we're going to die. So having these kinds of like, preparations ahead of time gives you like a sense of control in a way when otherwise you may not feel you have it. So it can actually be kind of like cathartic to know that you have your affairs in order. You have what you want lined up, and for you and your family or your loved ones. But I think that's one of the biggest issues with the funeral industry, the modern funeral industry, is that there is this sense of forced planning and there are limited options. Another thing is it depends on the cemetery that you go to, but some cemeteries, they are strictly vault cemeteries. So what a vault is, it's like when you go to build a grave and you dig a plot and you fill the inside of the plot with cement. And then that's when you insert a casket down in there, and then you bury on top of it. So what vaults serve to do, the only thing vaults really do is for an aesthetic purpose. And you're looking at a vault cost is probably an extra $5,000, $6,000 to a funeral cost. So, yeah.
Well, if I remember correctly too, with the vaults, that takes away the need to bury someone 6 feet because animals can't get in, to dig up. So now it's like only a foot to 3 feet, too. So the workers, or like the people who are actually doing the digging, that's beneficial to them, but the family in turn is spending a lot more money.
Oh my gosh, it's so much more money. And another thing too is like whenever you go to a cemetery and you see all of the headstones are perfectly aligned, that means that they use vaults, because vaults help they maintain the structural integrity of the land, because the land doesn't sink in. So whenever you see uniform gravestones that aren't, all different, like sinking into the ground or on different elevations, that means that they have vaults. So it's easier to mow the lawn and keep the grounds clean and structured and nice. And it's pretty, it's definitely pretty, but this is an added cost that people may not know that they really have an option to do or choose from. They could go to another cemetery that is, they don't use vaults, and you could just be placed directly into the ground. Or you could use a wooden casket, or a casket that's, or no casket at all, and just be wrapped in a shroud. So there's lots of different options there, but the standard is definitely a vault. And it's just such an expensive added cost. My family actually has, my mom's side in Louisiana, we have a family grave plot out in the woods, like out in like the woods of like nowhere, Louisiana. And we, like every few months, we go out there and we go grave tending. So I have probably about 50 or 60 like family members buried out there. And what we do is you get together, everyone bakes, some food. We have a giant like table out there. One of my family members will say a prayer, and then everyone goes and tends to the graves that date back to like the late 1800s, early 1900s. And you go and you clean the graves off, you rake, you mow, you just clean the graves. And they're all uneven because obviously there's no vaults and they were just placed into the ground. But it was interesting to me when I found out about that when I was younger, because I have some family that are buried in like traditional cemeteries, but I really liked the communal aspect of, you know, being with your ancestors and getting your current family together and like cleaning your family's graves. I think there's something like really intimate about that, as opposed to going to like a commercial cemetery in a way. And I think that there's like that tradition just seems so lost in modern day. So it's just something that's really different that I'm happy to be a part of. But I mean, it's also just something that a lot of people don't really think about. Like if you have land, you can definitely even do something like that. So the laws in burying your loved ones on your property is also an option. People don't think about it, but it's an option. And each state has its, you know, various laws on how to do that, as well as keep, you know, loved ones at home if you so choose to. So for me, if I knew that, you know, if I knew now, like what I didn't know back then, we could have kept my dad's body at home for like up to 3 days. And there's some places that would, or some cultures that would, you know, like tend to the body, like wash the body or just wrap the body, spend time with it. And each state has different regulations about it. The National Home Funeral Alliance is really good. They're a really great resource about home funerals and how to go about them. They also have a lot of resources right now for COVID. So if you're interested in that, definitely check out that organization and their website, because that's just another option that people don't really think about. You know, especially if someone does die in the home already, it's nice to kind of know, like, you do have rights, you do have options, and there's no like funeral police, you know.
Right.
There's also this misconception too that's widespread within the funeral industry, where if you stay with a dead body for too long that you would catch diseases. And that's not entirely true. Like the bacteria on a corpse is very different from the bacteria that viruses would have to like, that would cause an illness or make you sick. So I think that's something too that a lot of people kind of get freaked out about. And like there's the danger in the microorganisms presented on the body if it's not embalmed, and if someone is exposed. But you know, the bacteria involved in the decomposition process is not the same as the bacteria that causes disease, and that can be, you know, that's a myth that a lot of people think. There's another, in terms of embalming too, that's another thing that is very common in the American funeral industry that isn't 100% necessary. It's more for the people who are like attending a wake, for example, to keep the body looking at rest or natural. That's an additional $175, $500 to set the features of the corpse, whether that means, you know, painting the face, super gluing the mouth shut so it doesn't open, super gluing the eyes shut so the eyelids don't pop open.
There's something so morbid about gluing features closed.
Yeah.
I
don't know. After I saw My Girl, I went through a brief period where I thought it would be like really cool to be a mortician.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah,
I mean,
no,
I don't think
it wouldn't at all. Yeah.
I love My Girl. That was one of my favorite movies growing up.
Like, I'm gonna do the makeup, and it would, you know, because it's a service for the family. But then, like, learning more about it, it's like, yeah, no, I'm good. Thanks.
Well, yeah, and it's such a, I think that's a really sad movie, but it's good for kids to watch. I think that's a really good example of a death positive film, because, you know, Veda's character was always like, she even struggled with it.
Yeah.
And
he needs his glasses. He can't see without his glasses.
Oh my God, it's so sad. So sad.
Now everybody's crying.
I know. It's such a good movie, but it's so sad. Actually, though, side note, the very first like CD or tape that I ever bought was the My Girl soundtrack.
Nice.
Like, I love it. It has so many good songs on there because I love oldies, and I was like,
Yeah, it
obsessed.
does.
So I still have that. I think it's on tape, actually. Like the My Girl tape's pretty bad. Aging myself. But but yeah, you know, just considering all of this. Oh, going back to embalming though, completely not necessary, an added fee. The chemicals that are used in embalming are actually more dangerous than any sort of chemicals or bacteria that you might find on a corpse. So typically embalming at a funeral home takes about 3 to 4 hours, but it can also be dangerous for embalmers. So they no longer use arsenic to preserve bodies. They use formaldehyde, but that can also be deadly. Apparently, studies have shown that male embalmers are at a higher risk for leukemia and ALS as a result. And the U.S. CDC, the Centers for Disease Control, has actually shown that there's no benefit to the public health using embalming. So it's really an unnecessary practice. But again, it's another forced or encouraged, you know, added cost. And, you know, unfortunately, that kind of gets pushed on people when they're making decisions. So a lot of you know, a lot of big corporations are kind of taking up and buying up mom and pop funeral homes and increasing the prices, as well as centralizing the embalming facilities. And it sort of turns this into like, it sort of turns body preparation into like an assembly line where embalmers feel pressured to knock out a completed corpse in a certain amount of time. And even from like a practitioner standpoint, it takes away the fact that this is actually a human being, you know, so you're even more removed from that process in a way. So just the flaws in the funeral industry were always very, very unknown to me. And so many things that you think like having a vault or a casket is required or necessary. A lot of this is societal standards put upon you by the American funeral industry or American religion, you know, depending on what your religion says, what those pretty much standards adhere to. And also, you know, the details vary state by state. So being aware of those like religious observations and just offers or what's out there is super, super helpful. Another interesting thing to kind of keep in mind that I never really thought about beforehand was transportation fees. If you die in another state or another country, there's an added fee to transfer your body back to your home city or your home state in order to get buried or have a funeral process. So in going to have a conversation with a funeral director, that's another thing that is worth talking about, because that can get thrown into the cost that people don't realize, and that could be thousands of dollars depending on where you actually die. So and not a lot of people think about that. And this is kind of morbid, but another thing that people don't think about is the state of your body when you die. I grew up in Dallas, and we have this thing called the High Five, which is where like all these different highways intersect, and it's like 5 tiers of highway. And when it was first built, a guy threw his girlfriend over from the top. And
Jeez.
yeah, it's fucked up, terrible. And so her body was completely decimated, right? When I met with the funeral director that I spoke to in Dallas, it was at the cemetery that my dad's buried in. He actually told me that they got that woman and her body's buried there, but there was an additional fee to bury her because her body was not intact.
Oh my gosh.
Yeah, so placing the parts of the body, arranging it in a casket. They of course did a closed casket. They didn't have a wake, but like arranging her body was an added fee because of how mangled it was.
That's fucked up.
Yeah.
That's terrible.
Yeah.
Yeah, so I mean, there's lots of different ifs that are kind of that people don't really think about that can be snuck into added charges when you're planning funerals, and the traveling and the state of the body itself is one to definitely consider, because you're looking at upwards of like $1,000 for stuff like that. And they do add like insurance. You can have insurance on your body, so you can have travel insurance. Whenever you travel, you only have to pay a specific amount like per month. It's kind of like life insurance in a way, but it's for your death and your funeral planning. And if you travel a lot for business or for fun or whatever, if you pass away abroad, the cost to get your body back to your home is not nearly what it would be. And it's hard to make that kind of a decision, like back in my early mid-20s, I was traveling internationally a lot and I was backpacking a lot. And, I have a food allergy. So every time I would travel, I would send my mom an email and be like, hey, this is an updated like mini will, and these are all my passwords, and this is what I want with my body. This is who you contact and all this stuff. And everyone thought it was so morbid, but I was just like, well, what do you do?
Yeah.
Like, I'm not going to leave that on my mom. So, I'm not going to.
If something actually happened, that's it's huge to have all that taken care of.
Yeah, I'm not going to burden her with, all these plans to make on top of mourning. And I think that when people would say to me, oh, that's so, it's morbid to do this, it's morbid to do that, I'm like, I see it as being sympathetic and empathetic to my family and those who I love, because I have my shit together and they don't have to clean up after me. And they don't have to, they can just like mourn me if you want, but they don't have to take care of my belongings, my body. Like, I have it all covered. Like, y'all need to worry about it.
Well, it makes the process easier on everyone.
Exactly.
Then they can actually mourn peacefully, as opposed to having to make all these hard decisions for you.
Yeah. Totally.
Well, and have a non-family member there to wipe your hard drive so they don't see your search history.
Right? Oh man, being a horror author though, like when I writing about genre films a lot, my search history is pretty gnarly anyways. I delete it regularly because I'm like, oh God, like this is so embarrassing, people get the wrong idea. But yeah, there's just so many pros to it. And, there's a really great, this is all like the concept of being death positive, right? So, not thinking that death is so much like behind closed doors. It's good to our society to talk about it, engage in the conversation. It's not morbid, but it displays like a natural curiosity about the human condition. Planning about it can make a difference. You can actually change the culture around it by having these kinds of conversations. And choosing your end-of-life wishes is another thing. Another consideration to keep in mind too is for the LGBTQ and transgender communities, people who identify as that, they need to be mindful of their wishes as well, because some places, may not be as friendly to them in their aftercare as they would like due to discrimination. And, kind of like, it's unfortunate, but there are resources out there if anyone is concerned about that, for end-of-life planning. If you identify it's the same thing with like religion. If you're a certain religion, well, not really the same thing, but if you have like particular wishes and you don't wish to be discriminated upon, you do have rights in choosing what you want to do with your body, no matter who you are, which is great. And Caitlin's organization, the Order of the Good Death, they do talk about that and mention it. So there's this whole section of her website that goes through how to get your life and death together for your inevitable mortality, planning a funeral, where do you begin? There's also information about wills, how to write a will. Some states allow wills to be handwritten, others need to be legal through an attorney. So it's very much a lot of information that's state by state, but the orderofthegooddeath.com is just such an amazing resource to educate yourself on all of your options and how you can go about preparing, planning, and how you can ensure that your identity is protected as a trans or non-binary person, or really just anything. So
Marisa, that's awesome that there's resources for that, because I know it is an issue with like people dead naming, or like if they want to plan their service and they don't want certain photographs from their history used, and like so that's something that's awesome that there is a resource for people that need help specifically in planning that, because I don't want to say like blanket all families, but immediate family are the worst offenders for people in those situations that are going to ignore their wishes and do what they want anyway.
Yeah, totally. And I'm gonna I'll post this one particular resource page on our episode page for this one, so everyone can have access to it, and I can send it to y'all in Slack too. But it's just so refreshing, and it's just so amazing. Literally, they even talk about pets. I mean, it's anything that you want to know, need to know in order to best take care of yourself and your loved ones during, the death and dying process, and, mourning. There's even resources for grieving. And in doing that, you're ultimately, having a more fulfilled life because you have embraced your death, that you can appreciate your life even more, if that makes sense. So yeah, but those are kind of some of the things that I want to just like intro to first. Some of the, for the funeral industry that people may not really think about, that it's really helpful to start thinking about some common myths and just the prices as well. I mean, it's really unfortunate, especially now during COVID. People will set up GoFundMe's because they don't have funeral costs, and they're asking for like $20,000 just to have a funeral, and that's so much money, just to lay someone at rest. And these are all decisions that you make after losing someone, which is even harder. So I think it's really important and helpful to definitely look at this kind of stuff, at this point in time. I think it's like a weird blessing. But I'm going to pass it over to Liz, though, because I think that she has some really cool information on different options for burials, as opposed to just like cremation or the standard American burial process with like the wake and the vaults and all that stuff. So Liz, I'll let you take it over here and talk about alternatives.
Yes. So, just to like give a little bit of background, because obviously I did read the Caitlin Doughty book, and that was more recently for me. And I actually read her second book before I read Smoke Gets in Your Eyes. And her second book, now I'm forgetting how to...
From Here to Eternity?
Yes, From Here to Eternity. So I read her second book, From Here to Eternity, before I read Smoke Gets in Your Eyes. And I haven't read Will My Cat Eat My Eyeballs, but I have looked through it at the bookstore. And it was funny when you mentioned the bookstore specifically, because I feel like bookstores don't know what to do with her books. And so they are in like the grieving section. Like, it's like, there's like no other books like that in the grieving. Most of the rest of the books in that section are like spiritual books about like how to deal with like, whereas her book is so much about like, here's factual information about blah, 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 this situation, or here's what I do. And like this, it's funny because it doesn't really have a good spot in the bookstore, to be honest. But, I feel like it doesn't make sense in the section it's in. I mean, it does, because it is about grieving, I guess, but it's just so funny to be seeing it next to all the books that it's next to when you go into a bookstore. And so for me, I actually remember like at a young age, like probably in middle school, high school, I started thinking about like, I don't want to be buried. Like, I don't want my body to just sit in a casket and like slowly decompose over time. Like, I just didn't like that idea. Like, I'm just taking up, and I remember saying to my mom, like, I hate the idea of just taking up space that's not able to be used for something else. Like, you know, and so I think from like early on, I just knew that I wanted to look into alternative forms of like typical burial. Obviously cremation was my initial thought, because I was like, that's the only other one I really knew of when I was younger. And so I was like, okay, I want to be cremated, because then like at least I only take up like a vase. Like that's not that much space. And so, you know, and I think my mom was kind of like, oh, you know, like stop, you don't even.
Yeah, why are you talking?
You don't want to say stuff about that, you know, like why are you, you know? And I mean, she's like, not that she was saying that I shouldn't, you know, that I was doing something wrong, but like she was just like, oh, don't worry about it now, you know, kind of thing. And I think that's how most people are. And it makes sense, but because that's the culture we've grown up in. And so but I read Mary Roach's book Stiff in high school as well, and so that was kind of like a somewhat early introduction to a lot of concepts of like how do dead bodies get used for other things. And I was talking to the ladies before we started today about how we could have so many episodes about death and dying, and we could have a whole episode about how science uses dead bodies and stuff like that, because there is so many ways that dead bodies can be useful. And you know, when I turned 16 and I was getting my or actually I didn't get my driver's license until I was 18 because I was terrified of driving, but when I got my driver's license, I remember being like, I'm gonna be an organ donor, like immediately, like I don't need any of this stuff, I'm gonna be dead, why would I care,
take it out of me.
You know, I've just felt very strongly about that. Yeah, I mean, it's just like, what's the point, you know, I'm not using it anymore, and somebody else could, and that's a beautiful concept to me, that maybe like even in my death I could help someone. And so that's kind of where Caitlin's book really like touched me and like became important to me when I was reading it, because I was like, and I couldn't put it down either, like you mentioned, Marisa, like I just couldn't put the book down. I read it so fast, like I think I finished it in a few days. And I just think that her talking about, obviously there's so many traditions when it comes to death, and many other traditions are also not thinking about like the planet and like what is best for the world. And so I'm kind of focusing on stuff that I think is like better for the planet, and in a way that we can, you know, use our bodies after we've passed in a positive way, and like how we could help other people, help our planet, you know, all that kind of stuff. And so the first one I was going to talk about is human composting. And I just like am so surprised that we haven't tried to do anything with this sooner. And so it's, I mean, I guess I'm not, because it is kind of like morbid, I guess, to some people to think like, oh, my body's just gonna like dissolve into dirt. But I mean, it's also just, I think, to me, it's beautiful. But humans are so obsessed with preserving bodies. Like we just are. Especially, I think, like, I don't know, I think in the United States, the embalming thing, like you were saying, Marisa, it's like, it's not even really good. Like, there's no real good purpose for embalming other than that we like the idea of our body, like, staying preserved longer. Which is just like, we're just, you know, stopping the inevitable. I mean, we're just slowing down the inevitable.
That's why, like, to me, the whole, like, casket in the ground burial freaks me out. Because it's not natural. Like, when something dies, it decomposes. It's organic matter, and it should. And the whole thought of a loved one shoved full of chemicals that will never decompose, they're just kind of in this weird, like, limbo state in the ground forever.
Yeah. And like a luxury box.
That freaks me out. Like, I get, you know, whatever family thinks, I don't go to the cemetery. I've gone once to where my dad's buried, and he's not there, so I don't it freaks me out. Sorry, I just had to throw that in.
Don't be sorry.
Yeah. Well, I mean, it's just, what's the point? It does feel weird to me. Like, and I respect having like a place to go to like connect with someone.
Absolutely.
And I totally get that. But needing for it to be a space that like now is no longer usable by anything else and is just, I don't know. I do feel fairly strongly about the fact that I think cemeteries are like, especially modern cemeteries in the United States, are such a huge waste of space.
So much.
Like, I think about, you know, what we could be using that space for, and it just like, you know, I mean, think about all the people that don't have homes or like places to live. Now we also have tons of places to live that are not, you know, being used by humans, but that's a whole nother thing. But I mean, it's just sad to me to think that these huge pieces of land, and we're running out of space, really. I mean, at some point we will run out of space, like, and so that's what this company Recompose is kind of trying to do. They're trying to basically find ways that are better for the environment and more realistic for urban areas to take care of human bodies after they've passed. And so Recompose is the main company that I'll be this is the company I'll talk about when I talk about human composting. This is in Washington, and they actually just in 2019 have finally become legal to actually do human composting as like a burial option. So I mean, they were doing testing and they had that all approved where they could use human bodies, but it was more of a scientific test type thing. It wasn't like an option that you could use as like, this is what I want to do when I die. Like it wasn't an easy option, I guess I should say. Like obviously you could sign up and say, hey, I want my body to be used for science, and then it might go to this thing, but there was no guarantee, you know, to like say, I really want to become soil. And so with their process, the body is covered in natural materials like straw or wood chips, and basically over the course of about 3 to 7 weeks, you start to break down into soil. And so it's actually not a very long time when you think about it. They have, you know, they started out with cattle, and so they were able to turn a 1,500 pound steer, bones and all, into clean, odorless soil in a matter of months. And obviously we humans are much smaller than a 1,500 pound steer, so it takes a little bit less time to do that. And so the thing that I love about it too is that they still make it a personal experience for the family and for the people involved. And so as you are decomposing, you can have family come to visit you and visit your space that you are decomposing in. And then they get to choose what they want to do with the soil that remains. So whether that is to like, you know, people, I remember like, it's probably been 10 years or something. I remember there being this huge thing about like, oh, I want to be a tree when I die.
I remember seeing that.
You know, and people kept posting about like, and there was this thing, and I believe you could put your ashes in the soil, which honestly, ashes don't really have any nutritional value to the tree trying to grow. So like the likelihood that your ashes actually help the tree to grow is not super high. But with this, you truly would be helping, and like the nutrients from your decomposed corpse would truly be used to help grow a tree or whatever your family might decide to do with that soil. And so I think that's, again, a really beautiful concept.
So you could like grow veggies and eat me.
Yeah. That maybe creeps me out a little bit. Like, I don't know if I'd want to
stay
grow
on
food,
the island,
but,
Andrea.
Okay, sorry.
Better than flesh.
But yeah. But yeah, I mean, you could, you know, like a nice rose bush or something would be beautiful. You know, you could have something in your yard or somewhere that you as a family like to visit or whatever that might be. So anyways, I think human composting is something that I hope continues to grow. It's obviously, since 2019 is the first year that Washington State has been able to legalize it, it's probably going to take a while, but to me, this is the most likely option of the three I'm going to share with you guys today, that I hope maybe would be...
I just said, that makes sense.
Yeah, I mean, this is probably the most likely of the three that I'll share with you for what I could do to my body when I die, because I'm hoping that maybe it will continue to grow. Recompose is... their model is going to try to franchise eventually, so that funeral homes across the country can offer this option to people and to other communities. So obviously they need to get their first location really like up and running and figure out all the things that they need to figure out in order to start doing that, and then legalize it in other states, which I'm sure will take time. They've been working on this concept for probably 10 plus years before they have gotten to this point. So I mean, it definitely took them a long time. I think now that they're at this point, I think it will probably move faster. I hope, but it's still going to take time, and it takes time for communities to accept the concept. I mean,
I'm interested in how this relates. There's also the thing that's mushroom burial. And I don't remember the timeline on it. There was a Jay Rimleys who developed this, and it was like a suit that you would bury the cadaver in. The mushroom spores are woven into it, and as they grow, they consume the remains within the suit, as well as any toxins that are being released by the body. But the way I understand it, it like helps facilitate the decomposition. So I think that's something with the human composting, depending on time, they were talking about time frame and things, to make it a little more healthy, or like, this sounds terrible, speed up the process a little bit without using any sort of like chemicals or anything like that.
Yeah, and I mean, if you go to their website, which I highly recommend if you haven't checked out, it's just recompose.life. And first of all, their website is just designed so well. And my husband always jokes that I'm such a sucker for design. Like when I'm at the grocery store, I'm like, oh, this packaging is so much prettier than all the other packaging, so I'm going to buy this one. So maybe that's why I want to be composed.
Their website is beautiful.
Really, really
well, can I clicking around it? Can I add to that real quick? Because there's an excerpt from Caitlin's second book, From Here to Eternity, that talks about this, but this particular notion of it really resonated with me, and I thought it might with y'all as well, because in terms of like decomposition and our obsession with like maintaining the body, and especially for women, like maintaining this sense of youth and beauty, like even while we're alive, we're obsessed with it, right? So there's this part of the book where it says, humans are so focused on preventing aging and decay, it becomes an obsession. And for those who have been socialized female, that pressure is relentless. So decomposition becomes a radical act. It's a way to say, I love and accept myself. And since women's bodies are so often under the purview of men, whether it's our reproductive organs, our sexuality, our weight, our manner of dress, there's a freedom found in decomposition, a body rendered messy, chaotic, and wild. I relish this image when visualizing what will become of my future corpse, because when death care became an industry in the early 20th century, there was a seismic shift in who is responsible for the dead. Caring for the corpse went from a visceral, primal work performed by women to a profession, an art, or even a science performed by well-paid men. The corpse, with all its physical and emotional messiness, was taken from women. It was made neat and clean and placed in its casket on a pedestal, always just out of our grasp. So maybe a process like recomposition is our attempt to reclaim our corpses. Maybe we wish to become soil for a willow tree, a rose bush, a pine, destined in death to both rot and nourish on our own terms.
That is beautiful.
Wow. Yeah, that is beautiful.
Right? I love that.
Well, and to like go off of that, Recompose is founded by a woman, Katrina Spade. And so I think that she clearly, is embracing that concept of like, hey, this is what my body will naturally do. And I love that. And I want to give that as an option to, people out there. And Caitlin is an advisor for the company as well. So she's clearly very tied to this concept.
Yeah. That section.
The company itself is just, I think.
Oh, sorry.
Oh,
that was the excerpt, like when she interviewed Katrina. So, like her company and Katrina, who you were talking about, that was an excerpt that Caitlin wrote in her book after, like, that was her conversation with Katrina. So they're very much like, I love how there's like the feminine perspective to this as well, with like a female founder and like this image of like the female body and reclaiming, your own body even in death. I think that's so cool.
Yeah, that's awesome.
Yeah, it is really awesome. And like on their about me section, or like who we are or something, I think is what it's called, they talk about, you know, when they hire someone for their company, it's so important that they have a commitment to advocating for climate healing, for environmental justice, but then also advocating for protecting rights of people of color, religious minorities, undocumented people, queer. They have queer feminist practices of inclusion and equity. And so they are clearly, you know, they want to protect the rights of women, transgender people, and gender nonconforming people. So this is clearly a company that is really, you know, going forward and moving forward in a good direction. And so that makes me excited, because I hope that this can be something that grows throughout our country and becomes more of an option for people. And the last thing I will say about this is that it's also going to be a lot less expensive. Katrina said that she hopes that to charge no more than $5,500, which is a lot less than the average current burial. And so, you know, she hopes to make it no more than that. I'm sure if she can make it less, she will. And so they continue to do what they can for their community and just for the environment as a whole. So I really love this option, and I hope, like I said, that it becomes a wide choice for everyone here. So the next one that I want to talk about is the open air funeral pyre. And so this is the only open air cremation site in the Western world is in Crestone, Colorado. And so you actually do have to own property in Crestone, Colorado in order to use this service. And that decision was made out of respect for the local residents who didn't want their community to be overrun with outsiders who want just like a novel cremation. And the project is only geared to handle a limited number of ceremonies per year. So like, right now they really can only take people from their community anyways. There are people I have heard that have bought like just land in this area specifically to have their cremation done here. So I wrote in my notes as a joke, like I just need to figure out a way to buy like just a little square foot somewhere in Colorado, in Crestone, so that I can have this as an option. But it does sound really beautiful. I mean, basically you are covered in juniper leaves, and you're out on like a giant it's stone mostly. There's like a metal grate kind of to have the fire, and then your body is just burned into ashes. They don't have a way of like obviously separating your ashes from the ashes of the things that are used to burn the body, and so you do get like about 5 gallons worth of ashes afterwards. Your family does, which is a lot. But it takes about 4 to 5 hours to burn a body completely. And it just depends on your choice on what you want from the ceremony. It can be like a very simple service, quiet and private. You can have an elaborate ritual with eulogies, music, and singing. And it's just really up to you. So it's a very natural area. Obviously, there's mountains in the background in Colorado. It's very beautiful. I mean, like, again, you can check out some of their website stuff. If you look up open air funeral pyre in Colorado, you'll find it. But the pictures are really pretty. I mean, the space looks very pretty. It almost just looks like, a celebration when you see some of what they're doing, which is what I would want my funeral to be. I would want it to be a celebration of my life. And obviously people are sad, but you want to appreciate what the time you did have with that person. And so the staff there would work with you to figure out what is best for you and your family, to create a meaningful end of your life. And so I don't know, it's so pretty. Obviously it has connections. Some people compare it to like Viking funerals because you like send the body off into the water.
So Liz, that was where I was
shoot a
gonna
fire
go
area.
Because like I've always loved that whole concept of somebody shooting a burning arrow into the ship, and like, but apparently not only is it illegal, because of the boat on the water, it wouldn't stay burning hot enough long enough to actually like work, and in the end the body would just like be in the ocean, which I guess would be fine too. So this is awesome because I can't have the Viking funeral I wanted, apparently.
Yeah.
And people talked about, oh gosh, it's gonna smell horrible, and that's kind of the purpose to having the juniper, and they put other things with the body in order to make it smell like actually nice.
Sure.
And so it's kind of interesting because Caitlin even mentioned when talking about this that like the sensory elements of this are worth it just in that. Like just that's even beautiful. Which when you think about burning a body, it doesn't sound great. So the fact that they've found a good way to do that, I think is really amazing. And it's not quite as bad for the environment as a typical crematorium, just because they aren't having to use some of the chemical. I don't know the whole process of the crematorium process. I just know that it does emit some bad things into the air. It is still said that even with what they're doing, it isn't perfect. I think still like burning a body isn't necessarily always the best thing, but this is probably the best way to do that, to truly get rid of a body in this fashion, would be in this way, because they do it more naturally than some of the crematoriums would. But composting still being better for the environment. So.
Well, and I think cremation, with the incineration process, it emits substances like dioxin, hydrochloric acid, sulfur dioxide, and climate-changing carbon dioxide. So it's definitely, the carbon footprint is pretty significant. And yeah, it's pretty toxic. Yeah. And even like there was an article by National Geographic not too long ago that said like American funerals are responsible each year for the felling of 30 million board feet of casket wood. So like 90,000 tons of steel, 1.6 million tons of concrete for burial vaults, and then 800,000 gallons of embalming fluid.
Yeah, see,
it's
that's
very
so,
wasteful
like,
in a way. Yeah.
It's just, it's so wasteful. I mean, and that again, I mean, that's why out of these three, I mean, the last one is definitely the most metal of the options that I'm about to talk about. And the most unrealistic for me to ever have happened to me. But I do love it. But the first one, the composting, is the one that I really do want to work towards potentially having happen, because I think it is the best option for the environment that we can have in the U.S. So I do hope, I've said that like a million times, but I mean, it's just something that I hope we start taking climate change serious, and like that we also include this as part of the conversation, because I don't think, this is something that we're talking about really at all. I think when we talk about climate change, it's like, oh, big warehouses that are emitting, bad gases into the air, and like cars and that kind of stuff. I feel like that's what we talk about, but we don't talk about this business in this process, which just feels very pointless to me, because I'm like, this person is dead and now they're still like causing bad things.
And the point too that literally everybody dies, so this isn't something that only affects a few. We've had over 200,000 people die in the past 8 months alone from this novel virus, so like we should be having these conversations now more than ever for multiple reasons.
So let's move on to my personal favorite, which is Tibetan Sky Burial. And so first, let me ask, I'm assuming, I know Marisa probably had was familiar with this concept. Andrea and Kaleigh, were either of you did you know about this?
I had actually heard of this, yes.
I actually had not until I read over your notes for the episode, and then I looked into it more.
Yeah. So, this is not something I was familiar with until, again, reading Caitlin's book. And I gotta say, this is how I'd like to go if it was ever an option, but I do not think that would be an option for me. But it's just like you finally are one with the world again, and your body is truly being used, like in the circle of life, the cycle of life, whatever you want to say. Like, because basically, Tibetan Sky Burial, you're just gonna get eaten by vultures. So, this is a funeral practice in which a human corpse is placed on a mountaintop to decompose while exposed to the elements, or to be eaten by scavenging animals, especially carrion birds, aka vultures. So giant vultures come and eat the flesh off of your body, and then it is carried off to many, many places around China. So it just sounds like, obviously it doesn't sound that pretty because it would be disgusting, I'm sure, to watch. But there is something still beautiful in the grossness to me, because there's something amazing that I was like, hey, my body, which is being used for nothing, is now someone's food.
Mm-hmm.
Like, which of course, it's funny because I even said, like, I would never eat somebody's body in a cannibal episode, which I still wouldn't, but I still think this is cool.
So Liz, what you're saying is you want somebody to eat you.
Yeah, I guess so.
I just want to be clear. Post-mortem, though. Like,
oh, yeah.
That's the important.
Yes, after I die. And also, when I say somebody, I mean
like vultures, yeah.
I think...
cute little
vultures.
squirrels.
I don't think I want a person.
There's a difference.
Yeah.
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 No, I dig it.
So the reason that this...
No, I just said I dig it. Yeah.
Yeah. So the reason that this became a commonplace option in Tibet is because they're so high up that most of the ground is very rocky and it's hard to dig and actually create a place to be buried. So they didn't really have places to bury bodies. And then on top of that, they don't really have very many trees, so they're not able to get a lot of wood in order to cremate bodies. So something had to be done with the dead, and this was their solution. And so Tibetan Buddhists, Sky Burial and Cremations are templates of instructional teaching on the impermanence of life. And so this becomes part of their culture of like, hey, this is just part of how we live. Sky Burial, the like actual word for it is Jator. I may be saying it incorrectly. I did look up her pronunciation thing, but there was like 7 different options. So I still apologize if I'm not saying that correctly, but the word is spelled Jator, Jator. It's considered an act of generosity because it's on the part of the deceased, since you are basically providing food to sustain living beings. And so those are very important virtues in Buddhism, to like have compassion for all beings and generosity. And so that's why, again, this was part of their ritual at the end of life. And so it is usually performed really high up on a large flat rock. Families can be close by to pay their respects to the deceased, but it's very rare for them to want to actually watch the process. Because it is still, obviously not a pleasant thing to watch.
Right.
The biggest thing here is that recently tourism has become a huge problem because people keep trying to like come over and take photos. And like I watched some stuff on YouTube of like from National Geographic, I think, and it was like just like a crowd of people all trying to like get close enough to take pictures, and there was like monks standing there, obviously very like prayerfully, like respectfully trying to like pay their respects to this body, while people are like talking about like, oh hey, did the bus come by yet? Like,
oh my god, I hate that
like,
so much.
And they're just like,
yeah,
I know, it's very frustrating and disgusting. And so that has become a huge problem. Like, and there was even like a video that this lady was like, it was like a video that they put in of some lady who was like, I'm visiting Tibet, blah, blah, blah. Like, here we are. Like, and, you know, she's talking about it and she's like, oh, bummer. They didn't have a dead body today, so we didn't get to see a burial, like a Tibetan Sky Burial.
Wow.
And I'm like,
yeah,
that's
like,
that's
not okay.
terrible.
Yeah, so that has become a problem, which is really sad. But they continue to try to do this to the best of their ability. There is actually a person, it's either a monk or more commonly someone that's just literally hired to do this, where they're called body breakers or corpse cutters, which is pretty morbid sounding, but
That's
they
my
actually
band name. I'm called
are
right
the
now.
ones. Yeah.
Yep.
Corpse cutters.
Pretty metal, man. That's a pretty metal band name.
Yeah, I know. It is. It's super. That's what I said. This is like the most metal option of all of them. Now, I'm sure I'm sure that's probably very disrespectful because I would say Buddhism is not that metal, but it's very interesting. But they actually are in charge of taking the body apart to a certain extent so that the vultures have an easier time eating it. And then after the vultures have eaten most of the flesh off of the body, they go in and whatever bones are remaining, they are broken up with mallets and ground with barley flour, tea, and yak butter or milk. And that is then given to the crows and hawks that waited for the vultures to depart.
Wow.
So really, truly, like every part of your body is used in some way to feed an animal. Another thing is that if several sky burials take place in the same area, vultures may need to be coaxed into eating because they're like not hungry. And so they also like try to change up their locations. So they're not going to use the exact same place over and over again. There's usually like a limit to how many corpses can be consumed at a certain burial site. And this prompts people to find different areas. And then it's also believed that if too many corpses are disposed in a certain burial site, that ghosts may appear there. So, they take it very seriously as to how many bodies can be, buried in that certain area, which I think is probably smart because it's also just part of the, the ecosystem, like making sure that they change up what vultures, because if they go somewhere where there hasn't been as many burials, then those vultures are going to need the nutrients and the food, so it makes more sense in that aspect. But then also spiritually, they decided that that's part of it as well. But yeah, there was also a drop in population of the vultures, and so that became a problem for a little bit. I haven't found any current information as to if this is still a problem. The vultures were put under wildlife protection in China, so I think maybe that helped somewhat. But that's why I was like, we need to start doing that here, because from what I understand, there is a good amount of vultures in parts of the United States. So, we could be doing this here, and we could be helping that part of our ecosystem. And so why aren't we doing it?
That's what I was thinking about, the
this is ever
Painted
gonna happen in the
Desert,
United
or
States.
in Nevada, this, in the Southwest, there's a lot of places that would be, I feel like, good candidates for sky burial.
Mm-hmm.
Yes. I don't think we're ever going to get the United States to accept this concept, but
no. Everyone would be there with their
it's
Instagram, taking pictures, and it would be disgusting.
Yeah.
Yeah. Whoa, what is that noise? Sounds like creepy wind chimes. So finally, I just had a couple of instances where sky burial specifically was mentioned in pop culture. And so sky burials are among the methods of burial discussed in Neil Gaiman's The Sandman. And then it was also in the 2015 video game Bloodborne, which I have not played. But Eileen the Crow's bird-like attire is a reference to the practice of sky burial. And it's actually mentioned, I guess, in her attire's item descriptions. So kind of interesting that it appears in some of our Western pop culture, since it is obviously not a Westernized concept at all. But yeah, so all three of these options, I think, should be more widely used because they all are ways that we can take care of the dead and also be respectful to the earth that we live on. And so I hope that, we continue to grow as a society and talk more about death and learn from each other when we're talking about this, and start to move in that more death positive way, as Marisa kind of talked about. So does anybody else have any? I think Andrea, you mentioned you looked up another one that might be interesting.
Yeah, I had a couple that
did you want to kind of
I've always kind of liked, two of which are kind of the same. But one, you take your ashes and you put them into, it's similar to concrete, but then you get inserted into a coral reef. And there's a lot of issues with coral reefs. Ooh. And they're, like losing their habitat. And so it's very, very eco-friendly. Now you do have to be cremated first. And then it's only, I want to say I've seen between $1,500 to $3,000, depending on where you put yourself, to do the reef burial. But then if you don't like the cremation, there's the alkaline hydrolysis, which uses hot water and potassium hydroxide. And it basically boils down everything but the bones. Then the bones are ground into dust, but it's like less than half of the greenhouse gases and toxic emissions from a traditional cremation. So there is options coming available. And then my third one I really, really like. It's like $10,000 if you do a tree pod, where your whole body is put into this pod with like a tree seed, and then you grow into a tree as you decompose. Or if you wanted to go with a less expensive route, they do have one where you just take your ashes and put them in with the tree as it's buried. But the tree pod thing is very cool because it is a whole burial. And so I think that
and you're more likely actually helping the tree.
Yeah. So as you decompose, there's nutrients and it grows. But like I said, that one is still like, I think it was like $10,000 when I looked it up. So still pretty pricey. But the coral reef thing would absolutely be something very neat to do.
That's cool. I'd never heard of that.
Yeah.
Yeah, that is really cool.
I personally like the, I talked to you guys a little bit about this before, but the body farms that are used to study like decomposition in different areas, like if your body is found open air or if it's buried a foot underground, just studying how different climates and things affect the decomposing body. I think that's super interesting, and it helps scientists figure out what exactly happens to our bodies and help solve murders, and it's super interesting.
I think we all just want to be helpful.
Yeah, I think if exactly. We all just want to do something after we're gone. It's like if my body's going to be around, then might as well use it for something good. Well, I think that's probably about it for this particular episode. Like we said, there is a very good chance that we talk about burial and dying again in a future episode. If there's something that you, as a listener, are passionate about in this concept, in this community, we'd love to hear about it. So make sure you comment or mention it somewhere where we can see it, either on our Facebook or on our Instagram. And maybe we'll bring it up in our future episode about this, because we've talked about that there's so many things that we could go on and on about in this subject. So I think that it will definitely come back around. But before we leave today, we do want to, of course, talk about what has put a spell on us this week. And just, what are we excited about? What are we enjoying? So, Kaleigh, what's put a spell on you?
I gotta say, I saw a lot of people talking about this, and I finally, my job is closed right now at the moment, so I've had a lot of time to watch things, and I finally watched The Queen's Gambit on Netflix. That show is so phenomenal. Good. I honestly think I might rewatch it again, just because I essentially watched it in like 2 days. And it's everything about it. What is it? Anna Taylor-Joy, is that her name?
Anya.
Yeah. Okay.
Yes.
She's incredible. The story just of her character is super fascinating, and even down to like the littlest details, like the wardrobes and the set designs are amazing. I can't recommend watching that show enough.
That's a good one.
It's so good. Yeah.
Mine's actually a show too. I had kind of a stressful week, so I wanted something to make me laugh and that was a little bit more lighthearted. So I started watching Cobra Kai, and I'm obsessed with it. It's amazing. So if you're not familiar, it's basically a martial arts comedy drama that's based on the Karate Kid series. You can watch it just from the original Karate Kid. You don't have to watch all of them, but so the plot of the show is like it takes place 34 years after Johnny Lawrence loses. He's like now in his 50s, I think. He lost to like the Karate Kid, and Ralph Macchio and William Zabka both reprise their roles from the original film. And there's still this really hilarious rivalry between them, even as adults. Like LaRusso is super successful and is a car dealership owner, and then Johnny just like completely fucked his, life up and doesn't know what to do with himself. But he opens a dojo and brings back Cobra Kai essentially. So there's this aspect of like good and evil, and there's lots of really good character arcs. The martial arts is amazing, and the actors are all great, and Martin Kove comes back as well. And Martin Kove, I interviewed him last year for this film called VFW, and he is the sweetest man. He's just so precious. He's a precious human being. So like, I'm really excited that he is back on this show. So if you're a fan of martial arts or just the original Karate Kid, it's such a fun show. It made me laugh. Like, it's hilarious. It's so great.
So I've gone back and forth with mine, and there is a YouTube channel called Hiding in My Home. And I don't know have you guys heard of this?
No, it sounds disturbing though.
No.
Yeah. No, so I feel like this is going to be the evolution of the creepypasta. It is so far 20 videos. They're all between like 3 and 15 minutes long. And it details very strange events. I can't get into the story because it would totally be spoilery. But for anybody who's a fan of, it's kind of an experimental art type film. It's very basic, somebody with their camera phone, shooting little things. But so this started about 3 months ago, and just going through it doesn't take very long to watch all the videos, but it is extremely creepy. And the story's great, and I can't wait to see like how it all concludes. But like I said, Hiding in My Home on YouTube, definitely go check that out, and that's all I'm gonna say about it.
Interesting. Yeah,
I'm intrigued.
Go watch it.
Yeah, so mine is the HBO series that has recently started, The Undoing.
Ooh, I started that too.
And I'm already hooked as heck on it. I am enjoying it. I love Nicole Kidman, and I just want her to have a decent husband for her career.
Sorry.
She always has like the worst husbands. Like, but it's a great. I'm loving it. It's really intense. I've watched 3 episodes now, and it's a mystery. It's like a murder mystery, basically. But I think there's going to be some pretty interesting twists and turns. It's only 6 episodes, which I feel like is just like chef's kiss, perfect amount of episodes for me, for this type of a show, because I think sometimes these things get drawn out, and I'm like, okay, just tell me who did it and like why. I want to know. If it gets too drawn out, I feel like it becomes messy and not as good. But so I am looking forward to continuing the show, and I highly recommend it if you haven't watched it. I think there's 4 episodes available at this point, so and probably more by the time. Actually, it'll probably all be out by the time this episode comes out, so you can binge it. But yeah, it's a great show.
I've been enjoying it as well, Liz. Yeah,
that's on my list. I want to check it out. I'm glad y'all like it.
So, of course, continue to join us as we continue on. Our next episode 9, will be about what, Kaleigh?
The Watcher's house, right?
Yes. So we hope that you join us next time to learn about what the Watcher house is. Interact with us on Instagram, Facebook, and Twitter at Black Magic Coven, and be sure to use the hashtag Black Magic Coven. Like what you hear? Be sure to rate, review, and subscribe on Anchor.fm, Spotify, Apple iTunes, or wherever you listen to podcasts. And of course, we just love to hear from you. So if you like what you're hearing and you want to comment on what the episode was, We want to hear from you and interact with you on any of those social media platforms. But with that, this concludes the gathering of the Black Magic Coven.
You're listening to a Downright Creepy original on the Crickets Podcast Network.